Good afternoon. This is Joe Hall, and I'm celebrating Black History Month by celebrating the work of the Equal Justice Initiative. I'm completing the reading today of Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. Tomorrow we'll start on a new piece, Segregation in America. Chapter 6 is the trauma and legacy of lynching. The lynching era left thousands dead and significantly marginalized black people in the country's political, economic, and social systems. It fueled a massive migration of black refugees out of the South. And the lynching, and other forms of racial terrorism inflicted deep traumatic and psychological wounds on survivors, witnesses, family members, and the entire African American community. Whites who participated in or witnessed gruesome lynchings and socialized their children in this culture of violence were also psychologically damaged, and state officials' indifference to and complicity in lynching created enduring national institutional wounds that we have yet confronted or begun to heal. Establishing monuments and memorials to commemorate lynching has the power to end the silence and inaction that has compounded this psychosocial trauma and began the process of recovery. The need for monuments and memorials. In 2007, Sherlyn A. Eiffel outlined the critical need for memorializing the history of lynching in this country. Her powerful book persuasively made the case for why public memorials on lynching should be an American priority. Very few public commemorations of African American suffering during the post-slavery era exist today. Formal remembrances of national racial history tend to celebrate the civil rights movement victories, focused on individual achievements and success stories rather than reflecting on the deeply rooted violent resistance that upheld the racial caste system for so very long. Honoring civil rights activists and embracing their success is appropriate and due, but when they are not accompanied by meaningful engagement with the difficult history of systemic violence perpetrated against black Americans for decades after slavery, such celebrations risk painting an incomplete and distorted picture. Until the opening of the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice in 2018, no prominent monument or memorial commemorated the thousands of African Americans who were lynched during the American era of racial terrorism. Of the 4,084 Southern lynchings documented in this report, the overwhelming majority took place on sites that remained unmarked and unrecognized. In contrast, the landscape of the South is cluttered with plaques and statues and monuments that record, celebrate, and lionize generations of American defenders of white supremacy, including countless leaders of Confederate war effort and white public officials and private citizens who perpetrated violent crimes against black citizens during the era of racial terror. Many of these monuments, markers, and memorials have been erected in just the last 60 years. In this context, the lack of public memorials acknowledging racial terrorism is a powerful statement about our failure to value the African Americans who were killed or gravely wounded in this brutal campaign of racial violence. The era of racial terror calls for serious and informed reflection as well as public acknowledgement of the lives lost. President Jimmy Carter, commenting on the United States Holocaust Memorial, observed that because we are humane people, concerned with the human rights of all people, we feel compelled to study the systemic destruction of the Jews so that we may seek to learn how to prevent such enormities from occurring in the future. The effort to create a Holocaust memorial in Berlin reflected the sense that in the face of Germany's devastating history, a deliberate act of remembrance was necessary, a strong statement that memory must be created for the next generation, not only preserved. national commemoration of the atrocities inflicted on African Americans during the decades of racial terrorism is an important step towards establishing trust between the survivors of racial terrorism and the government and legal systems that failed to protect them. Meaningful public accountability is critical to bring the cycle of racial violence to a close. Formal spaces that memorialize mass violence help to establish trust between communities and build faith in government institutions. Lynchings occurred in communities where African Americans today remain marginalized, disproportionately poor, overrepresented in prisons and jails, underrepresented in decision-making roles in the criminal justice system, the institution most directly implicated in facilitating lynching and failing to protect Black Americans from racial violence. Only by telling the truth about the age of racial terror and collectively reflecting on this period and this legacy can we hope that our present-day conversations about racial exclusion and inequity and any policies designed to address these issues will be accurate, thoughtful, and informed. You can't duck it, America. Significance for the African American community, the level and type of violence that characterized lynching went beyond ordinary modes of execution and punishment. As historian Leon F. Litwack explains, the story of a lynching is more than the simple fact of a Black man or woman hanged by the neck. It is the story of the slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly invented forms of torture and mutilation. Whether the victims were family members, friends, classmates, acquaintances, or strangers, African Americans who witnessed or heard about a lynching survived a deeply traumatic event and suffered complex psychological harm. Even lynching or near lynching instilled an overwhelming sense of fear and terror in African Americans. Lynchings underscored the cheapness of Black life and reflected in turn the degree in which so many whites by the early 20th century had come to think of Black men and women inherently and permanently inferior, no less than human, a little more than animals. The traumatic experience of surviving mass violence creates insecurity, mistrust, and disconnection from people, a series of psychological harms that were amplified by the dangers inherent in navigating Southern racial boundaries. In the aftermath of lynching, African Americans became exceedingly circumspect in their dealings with white survivors, bore the burden of being indebted to their white friends for saving their lives. Anticipating white preferences and whims became a matter of safety and survival for Black Southerners, leading one African American living in Atlanta in 1906 to comment about the prominent role white expectations played in Black people's lives. We don't talk about much else. It's sort of life and death with us. In her study of lynching, lawyer and scholar Sherilyn Eiffel explains that the killings created a deep well of suspicion among African Americans who became hyper-vigilant around white people and taught their young children to do the same. She describes a white judge's recollection of his Black playmates' deferential behavior days after a lynching in their community. When the young Black child encountered his 5 or 6-year-old white playmate, he quickly stepped off the sidewalk as his fearful mother had instructed him to do. Black survivors often strictly observe racial boundaries in the aftermath of a lynching. At the same time that lynching provided whites a sense of community and enabled white men to affirm and perform their manhood by protecting white Southern women, it undermined African Americans' sense of community by forcing Black men, women, and children to witness horrific acts perpetrated against their family and friends and neighbors, emphasizing the power of white men through the targeted torture and death of Black men, many for stepping outside their relegated social roles by achieving economic success or demanding better treatment. Lynching undermined Black manhood and ensured that Black men who defended Black womanhood were likely to lose their lives in the effort. This culture of fear created an environment in which African Americans who witnessed lynching or lost friends or family or to racial violence were afraid to discuss their experience and risk violent reprisals if they dared to openly share what they had seen. Their trauma was intensified by a culture of silence about racial violence that grew out of the same systemic terror that produced racial violence. In many ways, this fear survives and the culture of silence endures. 75 years after witnessing the 1931 lynching of a classmate, one African American man remained unable to talk about the experience except to say that it was the worst thing he'd ever seen. Millions of Black Americans left the South between 1910 and 1970, a period of 60 years, in response to the instability and threat of violence that racial terror created in the region. These largely involuntary relocations compounded the trauma suffered by racial terror survivors, even as leaving the South improved their physical safety. After generations in this country, Black Americans who moved to the North and West were exiles, internally displaced people who had more in common with the vast movements of refugees from famine, war, and genocide in the other parts of the world than with their new neighbors. African American migrants were less terrorized in their new cities and towns, but they were not entirely welcomed. Institutional inequality, continued marginalization, and unaddressed histories of trauma have created a unique legacy of chronic generational poverty, persistent urban distress, debilitating violence, and limited educational opportunities. The traumatic legacy for the white community, the psychological harm inflicted by the era of terror lynching extends to the millions of white men, women, and children who instigated, attended, celebrated, and internalized these horrific spectacles as collective violence. As myriad social science studies have documented, participation in collective violence leaves perpetrators with their own dangerous and persistent damage, including harmful defense mechanisms such as diminished empathy for victims that can lead to intensified violent behaviors that target victims outside the original group. In addition, perpetrators and bystanders may continue to devalue the group they victimized for years afterwards and remain unable to acknowledge their actions, even though their personal and collective rehabilitation depends on that acknowledgement. The foundational role that lynching played in the socialization of white children during this era illustrates the racial violence deep cultural impact as attendees and participants in the lynching. Southern white children were taught to accept and embrace traumatic violence and the racist narratives that underlying it. At one Kentucky lynching, young white children between 6 and 10-year-old brought wood and tended to a fire in which the victim was burned. Boys especially were expected to actively engage in lynching. Their roles expanded as they got older until as young adults they took on a direct role in the torture and the murder. Lynching was characterized as a civic duty of white Southern men who brought praise rather than sanctions from community elders and institutions. An African American woman who worked for a white family in Alabama during the lynching era observed that lynching messages received early and burrowed deep. "I've seen very small white children hang their black dolls," she explained, "and it is not the child's fault. He is simply an apt pupil." In 1906, after a young white boy in North Carolina was injured by his 11-year-old white playmate who hung him from a noose fastened to a nail during a lynching game, the mother of the 11-year-old boy refused to reprimand her son for his role in the mock lynching, because playing lynching was so popular a pastime for Southern white children that the game was named Salisbury, presumably after a series of lynchings in Salisbury, North Carolina in 1902 and 1906 that included a 15-year-old black child among its victims. White women and girls played a central role as accusers and thus instigators of lynching. In the lynchings committed in reaction to rape accusations, white adolescent girls accounted for more than half of the accusers. Even when rape accusations were disproved or directly contradicted, the white women and girls responsible for the claim suffered neither social stigma nor criminal prosecution for their role in instigating the murder of innocent black men and boys. Socializing girls in such an immoral framework communicated a devaluation of black life and inflicted psychological damage on them. Narratives emerged after the lynching era that blamed lynching on a minority of Southern white extremists, but reports of the day clearly demonstrate that participating in lynching was widespread among Southern whites. Lynchers tended to be ordinary and respectable people, animated by the self-righteousness that justified their atrocities in the name of maintaining the social and racial order from which all white people benefited. Generations of white people were raised in communities where myths of racial superiority dominated and went largely unchallenged. Many of those hold powerful positions today. There is no significant effort to confront white Southerners with the damage done by lynching or to facilitate recovery, and we live with the lingering legacies of that inaction. Marianna, Florida, a town of less than 10,000 located in the Florida Panhandle. Marianna is the seat of Jackson County and the site of a Civil War clash known as the Battle of Marianna. Revered as Florida's Alamo, the battle occurred on September 27, 1864, between Union forces and a hastily formed Confederate Union comprised mostly of local boys and elderly men. At the battle's end, the local Episcopal church was burned with many of the Confederates inside, and several of the buildings were destroyed. Marianna celebrates its Civil War history with Marianna Day, its annual festival and reenactment of the Battle of Marianna. Several markers and monuments in downtown Marianna reflect local historical pride as well. The oldest memorial is a large oblique erected on the courthouse lawn in 1888 that lionized Confederate soldiers as warriors tried and true who bore the flag of our people's trust and fell in a cause, though lost, still just, and died for you and for me and you. A visitor would never know that Marianna is also the site of one of the nation's most well-known public spectacle, lynchings. On October 19, 1934, Claude Neal, a 23-year-old black farmhand, was arrested for the murder of Lola Kennedy, a young white woman whose body had been discovered just hours before. 5 days later, 6 white men seized Neal from an Alabama jail where he had been moved for safekeeping and returned him to Jackson County, where they killed him in the woods before presenting his corpse to the Kennedy family and gathered a mob. The corpse was castrated, his fingers and toes amputated, the skin burnt with hot irons. The mob then drove over it with cars, shot it at least 18 times, and hung it from a tree on the courtyard lawn, where they again shot at it and took pieces of skin as souvenir. When the sheriff cut the body down and refused to rehang it, the angry mob rioted, burning the homes of Mr. Neal's family members and threatening black residents with violence until they fled. The murder and subsequent attacks are widely reported in national and local newspapers, and it is a well-known 20th century example of an especially gruesome lynching. Marianna's legacy of violence and racial mistreatment includes the Dozier School for Boys, a state juvenile reform school that operated in Marianna from 1900 until 2011. The school faced serious allegations of abuse and closed during a federal investigation. In 2014, researchers conducting an excavation project uncovered the remains of 55 boys in the school cemetery, which was 24 more than were documented in official records. Surviving former residents shared the experiences they endured at the Dozier School, which remained racially segregated until 1967. Richard Huntley, a 67-year-old black man sent to the school at age 11, recalled that white boys were given vocational work while he and the other black boys were made to work in the field planting and picking crops for state profit. It was kind of like slavery, he told reporters in 2014. In 2014, Mariana celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Mariana by honoring the memories of Confederate soldiers and officers who fought and died to preserve slavery and the white supremacist ideologies on which slavery was built. The community voice remains silent as to Mariana's other legacies. No prominent memorial or marker tells of Claude Neal's brutal lynching, and that silence is deafening. The importance for the nation. Like mass rapes in the former Yugoslavia, terrorism against political dissidents in Argentina, and the torture and violent repression of black South Africans under the apartheid regime, terror lynchings in the American South were not isolated hate crimes committed by rogue vigilantes. Lynching was targeted racial violence at the core of a systemic campaign of terror perpetrated in the furtherance of an unjust social order. Lynchings were rituals of collective violence that served as highly effective tools to reinforce the institutions and philosophies of white racial superiority. Lynch mobs intended to instill fear in all African Americans, to enforce submission and racial subordination, and to emphasize the limits of black freedom. Through lynching, whites demonstrated to blacks that any transgression of social and racial boundaries, real or imagined, placed the lives of all African Americans at risk. The United States government compounded the psychological harm experienced by African Americans by permitting the torture and murder of black citizens. Federal and state officials in action communicated that no democratic institution valued black citizens' lives enough to protect them against terrorism by local officials and private citizens alike. They have a license to kill anything but a nigger, explained one African American man from the Mississippi Delta. You see, niggers are always in season. Today, public and private institutions in the South memorialize the Confederacy and celebrate the architects of white supremacy while remaining conspicuously silent about the terror, violence, and loss of lives inflicted on black Americans during the same historical period. This selective public memory compounds the harm of public officials' complicity in lynching and maintains the otherness of black people who have lived in these communities for generations. In 1908, a black man named Eli Pigott was arrested in Brookhaven, Mississippi on allegations of raping a white woman. Before the trial commenced, the judge promised the public that lynching Mr. Pigott was unnecessary because he would plead guilty and face swift execution. But when Mr. Pigott was returned to town by train, hundreds of local whites who had gathered at the station seized and hung him from a tree near the courthouse. Critics questioned a malicious failure to prevent the lynching, to which Mississippi Governor Edward Noel responded that state officials could not be expected to protect so hideous a malefactor from a deserved vengeance. On August 13, 1955, also in Brookhaven, a white man shot and killed Lamar Smith, a 63-year-old black voting rights activist, in broad daylight and in front of several witnesses on a courthouse lawn. Mr. Smith died steps from the site where Eli Pigott was lynched less than 50 years earlier. No one was prosecuted for either man's murder. Today, Brookhaven bills itself as the home seeker's paradise, and the courthouse lawn bears no testament to the community's history of racial violence. Erecting monuments and memorials to commemorate lynching can begin to correct our distorted national narrative about this period of racial terror in the United States history, while directly addressing the harms borne by the African American community, particularly survivors who lived through the lynching era. Scholars who have studied the impact of human rights abuses emphasize that speaking out about victimization can have a significant healing impact on survivors of genocide, mass violence, and other harms. Continued silence about lynching compounds victimization and tells victims and the nation as a whole that their pain does not matter. Publicly acknowledging lynchings can link instances of individual loss and harm to a broader system of abuse and mass violence and empower effective individuals to move beyond trauma, hopelessness, numbness, and preoccupation with loss and injury. Public acknowledgement and commemoration for mass violence is essential not only for the victims and survivors, but also for the perpetrators and bystanders who suffer from trauma and damage related to their participation in the systematic or the systemic violence and dehumanization. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission established by the South African government in the aftermath of apartheid elicited the stories of bystanders and perpetrators of the torture and violence against black citizens, as well as stories of victims. This enabled members of the white community to publicly acknowledge what happened to the victims and reorient themselves with the new national agenda as active participants rather than passive observers. Public commemoration plays a significant role in prompting county-wide reconciliation. Formalizing a space for memory, reflection, grieving can help victims move beyond anger and a sense of powerlessness. Memorials have been known to reconcile complicated and divisive national events. The Vietnam War Memorial, for example, is a powerful space for Americans and others to appreciate the historical context in which the war was fought and to grapple with the harm and the death it caused. The importance of collective memory is the thread that connects national efforts to recover from human rights crisis in countries and communities in the 20th and 21st centuries. One key lesson has emerged: survivors, witnesses, and all members of the affected community need to know that society has acknowledged what happened to the victims. Through a criminal tribunal, truth commission, or reparations project, suffering must be engaged, heard, recognized, and remembered before society can recover from mass violence. Commemorating lynching through memorials and monuments that encourage and create space for the restorative power of truth-telling is essential if we are to help society heal its sickness and place trauma in the past. The Equal Justice Initiative is ready for this effort, and we hope that you can join us. Part 7, Conclusion. Lynching in America is a form of terrorism that contributed to a legacy of racial inequity that our nation must address more directly and concretely than we have to date. The trauma and anguish that lynching and racial violence created in this country continues to haunt us and to contaminate race relations in our criminal justice system in too many places across this country. Important work can and must be done to speak truthfully about this difficult history so that recovery and reconciliation can be achieved. We can address our painful past by acknowledging it and embracing monuments, memorials, and markers that are designed to facilitate important conversations. Education must be accompanied by acts of reconciliation, which are needed to create communities where devastating acts of racial bigotry and legacies of racial injustice can be overcome. Lynching in America. Bryant A. Stevenson, Executive Director. The salute to the Equal Justice Initiative and Black History Month. Tomorrow we will begin reading the piece Segregation in America. Have a great day.